I'm Hemant Mehta.
This is Jessica Blumke.
And you're listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. And we're here today with Zach Weinersmith, who you may know as the author of Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, the wonderful webcomic. And he's also the author of a forthcoming book, Augie and the Green Knight, which we'll talk about in just a second. Zach, thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
So I have to ask, how did you even get started? Because your webcomic is one of the few that I read on a regular basis. How do you even get started in something like that?
Oh, man. I hesitate to give advice to anyone now because I did it so long ago, but I started what you might call the current run of the comic at least, say, 10 years ago, but really, developing some kind of skills maybe 15 years ago. And mostly it's just been trying to post a comic every day and hoping people like it. I wish I had better advice.
One of the things that I really like about the comic is that it has such a diverse array of subjects that you tackle. So one day it'll be making a joke about physics, another about math, another about biology. I mean, you have to know a lot of different subjects and not just know them, but know them to a point where you can make jokes about them. So where is all this knowledge coming from? Are you just that smart? Are you studying these different subjects on a regular basis?
Well, yes and no. So one, I do cheat. I have a wife who's a biologist, and that helps with a lot. But I consider it my job to do nerdy comics. So nerds get mad at you if you're not accurate. In fact, I just screwed up yesterday on a physics joke, so I'm not certainly not perfect, but I do try to read a lot. I feel like that's my main job in the universe at this moment, is to intake information and spit out amusing observations.
Well, I find in my personal experience that sort of the geek culture and the nerd culture, they tend to be very possessive of their subjects. Do you find, obviously you said you kind of had a blunder yesterday, do you find people get really up in arms when you mess something up?
In my experience, I usually get the benefit of the doubt. I mean, now and then you get someone who's really angry, but usually people have been pretty nice to me. But I don't know. My general theory is on that matter is you usually get the audience you deserve. So if you're the kind of person who is, comicked about how everyone's wrong and you're right, you'll probably get an audience that feels the same way. So I feel like I have a fairly sympathetic audience that will gently correct me when I'm being stupid.
I've got that experience too, writing for, Hemant and I write for the Friendly Atheist blog, and I always say, we have the best readers, and they're so supportive, and they'll come to your defense if somebody attacks you, but if you use poor logic or bad reasoning, they're on you. They won't let you get away with anything. It's made me a more careful writer. Yeah. That's for sure.
Yep, that's good.
What do you read for inspiration or just for fun? What other webcomics do you read? What other comic strips do you read, if any?
I read comics by my friends, but actually, almost as a policy, I don't really read comics because I don't want to sort of be copying other people. I would like to try to offer a unique, as much as possible, unique comic. So I actually don't read comics very much at all. To be honest, lots of comics are for children and idiots.
So one thing, I don't know if you ever see the comics pages, though, the ones that are still in the newspaper or whatever's left of newspapers these days, they're, for the most part, most of those comic strips, the ones that are syndicated, the ones that are more famous that people read every day, they don't really strike me as funny. And maybe that's just me, but they don't seem like they're that original, that unique, or that clever.
Well, it's because you're a young, hip guy,
Hemant. Oh, yeah, that's what I tell myself.
Comics are for old people.
Yeah.
But what is it about those comics that makes them so appealing to the mass? What is it about those comics that are so appealing to the masses? And what do you think has been special about your comic that certainly draws a niche audience, but you seem to have a very strong fan base?
Well, to answer this first question, my inclination with the Sunday comic page, or the newspaper comics, is the incentivization structure. This is a nerdy podcast, so I guess this is okay. The incentivization scheme is kind of crummy, I think, because it's very hard to break in. I mean, once you're in, newspaper editors don't really care about the cartoon section, so you're sort of in, and you get paid reasonably well if you're in enough newspapers. But also just in terms of distribution, if you are a comic on the Sunday page, you're bundled with a ton of other content. So one, you can kind of hide out if people aren't actually laughing out loud at your comics. But two, and this is the real bummer, is you can't do anything the least bit edgy or racy. I won't say maybe you can do the least bit edgy, but just the least bit edgy, racy, sexy content. Like everyone, when Boondocks was in the papers, that was considered super edgy, but it's not even close to anything on TV,
Right.
And so I think that's why you're recognizing that almost all of the comics, and there are exceptions, but most of the comics in the newspaper are these trite, banal, insipid, Hallmark garbage comics. I probably just insulted like 10 million people. But you know what I'm talking about.
But the strange thing is you insulted 1 million people. None of them are the ones that are your fan base.
Or we're listening to a podcast right now.
So I got that going for me. I guess it's that there are some, Bill Watterson, I would say, was not the least bit edgy, at least in terms of the usual metrics for that, and he still did beautiful stuff. So it's possible. It's just not what you usually get, let's say. What was the second question was, what, do people read my comic?
Well, you definitely inspire a lot of passionate fans, and I don't necessarily hear about those passionate fans of, say, Garfield or something like that.
Wait, no, hold on. I really like Garfield.
The passionate fans of Garfield are 10 years old. Is I think
come to Muncie, Indiana with me. There's a mural of him.
You're in with the wrong crowd. But in terms of my comic, I have no idea, honestly. It surprises me whenever I hear from someone who says, I've been reading your comic for 5 or 10 years or something, because the comic has changed. Like, I feel like every 2 years or so, it changes fairly significantly. And so it really surprises me that people do that. I wonder if part of it is they're just sort of, they're contemporary with me age-wise, and so they sort of grow up with me and keep reading, so maybe that's part of it. But I would say to the extent I feel I have any advantage over other comics is I at least feel like I try most of the time to be putting out content that I don't think other people could do. If I have an observation I think someone else probably has already made, I try to avoid it. I really try very hard to have new ideas. I often fail at that. I did a while back. I did a joke. I feel like an idiot saying this. Even I did a joke about T-Rex having small arms, and then I got informed by every paleontologist that that's like an insult to paleontology. They're like, of course, T-Rex has small arms. It's the oldest, stupidest joke. So heads up, the T-Rex small arms joke has already been taken. But I do try. I think that's the thing a lot of people skip. They want to try to do joke ideas that are familiar and will go viral, etc. And I think that's maybe a good short term, but in the long term, I do think you want to try to differentiate yourself. And so I do try to do that.
What is it? One of the things that is really amazing about your work that I found is that you do your comic on a daily basis, and you put out a comic every single day, and then on the side, you seem to be doing, I don't know, it feels like 100 other projects. You're working on a new book. You're putting out a video with SMBC Theater or something. First of all, one, where do you find the time to do all this? And two, what is it that drives you to do so many different types of things? Because it's never just drawing, and it's never just writing. It's always something different.
In terms of finding time, I should say we just had a baby 2.5 months ago, so time is drying up real fast.
Congrats.
But usually I do actually keep a sort of life schedule, like, a list of things to do during each day, and it's fairly extensive. I mean, I'm also a profoundly boring person. I think if I didn't have to, I would never leave my living room. I kind of just try to sit around reading books all day to the extent that I can. So that helps. But in terms of desire to do it, I don't know. I feel like people are very impressed by the daily comics thing, but I've been doing so long, it's like riding a bicycle. Or, like you see someone who can do an amazing trick, like someone who can juggle 5 balls, and it's very impressive, but it's like, once you can do it, it's not a big deal to keep doing it.
Once you get in the groove.
I kind of feel like I have the comic writing thing fairly well at hand, which means I have free time, and I have all these stupid things I want to check off my list, and writing kids' books is one thing I'm doing now, and that's sort of a thing I wanted to do I think before I wanted to do comics, I wanted to write kids' books, so I'm sort of using both the platform and the available time I've created to see how bad I am at other things.
To see how messed up you can warp kids' minds.
Oh yeah, hopefully they need more warping. There's not enough warping in books these days. Books were a lot more screwed up 50 years ago. It was better that way.
So what is Augie and the Green Knight all about? That's your new book that you are Kickstartering right now.
Yes. Where to begin? Augie and the Green Knight. Are you either of you familiar with the old medieval romance, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight?
Yep. I'm vaguely familiar.
It's okay. I have a literature degree. This is
me too.
In my original write-up for the Kickstarter, I was like, "No, you probably all know this story," and she was like, "Nobody knows this story." So there's a very famous medieval romance called Gawain and the Green Knight. It's actually quite readable for I want to say 15th century story. And I'll give you the story in miniature just to not waste time. The basic story is King Arthur and his court are sitting around and for Christmas, I believe. And one day this giant green knight shows up and he says, "Let's play a game where one of you beheads me, and then later I behead one of you. That sounds fun." And Sir Gawain stands up and he says, "I'll be the one to do it." And so he cuts off the Green Knight's head, and then the Green Knight picks up his head and says, "All right, great," and then says, "I'll see you in a year at my place." And then the story is about Sir Gawain going to this other place and finding it, and I won't spoil the ending for you. But you see it's sort of a comedic drama story. It's very, very good if you can get past a little of the old-timey language. But anyway, so my book is a sort of retelling of that story with the injection of this character of a little, very rational, very scientific girl who sort of falls into this fantasy setting where there's this Green Knight who's on his way to go behead or get beheaded, and she falls into this situation where the Green Knight is going to behead Sir Gawain and doesn't understand why it's a problem because he might do that. And so the story is kind of, there's more to it than this, but the main story is her sort of trying to argue with him about whether it's okay to do this, and using a lot of scientific or rational or mathematical ways to discuss it.
And is it intended to be, I know the story itself is just one, is it intended to be a series with this little girl, or is this just a one-off?
It's intended to be a one-off, I suppose, although... So it's funny because I had this idea for this story maybe a couple of years ago, and I really liked the idea of retelling the story from a little girl's perspective, and but it definitely, it's written as if it's a one-off. I can imagine. I mean, this thing, I did not expect this project to do as well as it's done so far, and so now I feel like everything's on the table, and I've this book is kind of a book I in a big way wrote because I wanted to read it to my kid, and so if people seem to like it, and I still don't know, people are kind of going on faith with this project, but I hope they like it, and if they do, I think at this point be happy to write a sequel. But the original is not written as if it's like the adventures of this kid doing this one thing. It's meant to be a whole story with a beginning and a change in the outlook of the character, that sort of thing. But I wouldn't be averse to doing another one.
So let's talk about the success of this. I mean, you had a Kickstarter goal of $30,000, and as we're talking right now, and there's still weeks left in your Kickstarter, it's already at $220,000.
Yeah.
What is it? Why are so many people giving to this project? Do you think it's because they support you? Do they really like the story? What is it that inspires this passionate fan base?
Teach us the secret of your ways, please.
I wish I knew. I mean, I have some thoughts, I guess. I just have a fan base who are nice enough to sort of follow. I think at this point people are used to me doing weird projects, and we do try to make sure they're always high quality, so that even if you buy it and it's not your cup of tea, at least I don't want you to feel like we're just shoving stuff off on you. So I think I hope we have a good track record, but also this one, from a business perspective, has some nice hooks on it, which is as I noted on the Kickstarter, at least as far as I know, there are not a ton of stories that have the kind of female protagonist I would like to read to my daughter about. That is, even the good ones, even the characters who aren't completely helpless do tend to be academic rule following types. There aren't. a lot of sort of adventurous girls. I feel like the one thing I feel like I almost never see is a female lead who's okay looking stupid. Like trying something and making a mistake and feeling ashamed and getting back up. I feel like even you get good characters like Hermione Granger, say, but they're the ones telling the boys, now calm down and relax. And I wanted to write a girl who was not just smart, like had read books, etc., but who could get into trouble. I thought I hadn't read much of that, and it sucks. It was a bummer because I love old Victorian adventure novels, and this isn't quite in that vein. But it sucks because I have all these books I love that I probably can never read to my daughter because they're Victorian, so they're chock full of racism. So I kind of wanted to bark up that tree a little to sort of recreate some of what I like about those stories without them being full of racism and sexism and a little anti-Semitism and nationalism and
gotta love those anti-Semitic children's books.
Yeah, it sucks, doesn't it?
How does having a child? I mean, it's only been a couple months, but how has that impacted sort of the work you do? Has that influenced any of your comics at all? Is that going to change the type of work that you do? Are you going to focus on more children's work now?
In my main comic, I definitely sort of, despite myself, find myself doing more jokes about parenting and about kids. But I'm adamant that I'm not going to start doing cute comics. I refuse. But so that hasn't. I feel like I haven't softened, which makes me feel good because I talk to a lot of dads who are like, "Oh, there's some stuff I don't like to joke about anymore," and I guess I don't feel that way. I think it's still funny. But I do, I do want, even if we don't do a sequel per se to this book, I have a couple other projects. I kind of it's probably just crazy parent stuff, but I'm like, I really want to write a lot of little girl hero books because there just aren't a lot of them. And it drives me nuts when you read, it's not so bad right now because she's 3 months old, so all the books, her books are like 10 words long, so there's not a lot of space for them to be asinine. Although some of them, they get there. But it really drives me up a wall. You read these adventure books, and they almost always have a girl character who's just passive, and it kills me. And I'm like, it all seems much more urgent all of a sudden. So I'm sure that'll be something I work on.
I feel like recently there's been kind of that uprising of people criticizing Disney princesses, which is something I was just talking to a friend of mine who has a daughter that, it was never something that occurred to me when I was a kid that Snow White had absolutely no faculty unto herself. Like, everything that happened to her happened because something else happened. And I don't know, I read all the Disney princesses and watched the movies growing up, and I don't know, I wonder how much does that really affect us? And I'm not saying it, clearly, I'm sure it has a larger cultural effect on us all, but as individuals, I wonder how much of an effect loving Disney princesses had on me.
So I know a little. So I just by coincidence, I happened to online meet Professor Lynn Liben, Liben, and she was one of 3 authors on an excellent textbook called Gender Development, which I highly recommend because, as I'm sure you both know, anything with the word gender in it is super political and fraught and impossible to discuss on the internet. This book is very empirical, very as empirical as you could hope for on such a topic. And so there is evidence that, and there's always a chicken before the egg argument here, but there is evidence that girls who have what they call a stronger gender schema, that is, girls who believe in sort of more gender essentialism when it comes to things like what jobs you can do, tend to experience the infamous fall off in math ability late in high school at a higher rate than girls who don't have that. Now, whether that comes directly from Disney princesses, I don't know. But so having read that, it made me sort of concerned, to make sure. I mean, for whatever I do, I don't want my daughter to think that jobs or occupations or hobbies or whatever fall along gender lines, at least in a biological sense. So, like I say, it's very hard to draw a cause and effect line from the fact that Snow White is not a plot-making character to, my daughter suddenly started hating maths in 10th grade. But there does seem to be a correlation, and furthermore, it varies from country to country. So clearly, there is a cultural effect at work.
One of the no, I'm sorry about that. One of the questions that, since you're talking about math, I think at one point, and I don't know if you still do this, you had a website where you were kind of explaining calculus concepts, and it wasn't funny. It was actually, you were explaining calculus concepps. Where was that coming? Was that for you? Was that for an audience? And what was the purpose of that site?
So, I actually, I'm hoping to get back to it. Things got a bit derailed with this whole baby thing, and you know, my wife's an academic, so we move a lot, so I got a little behind on it, but I was really enjoying it. So I don't know if you know my academic history, but I have a degree in literature, and I decided years later to go back, long story short, to get a degree in physics. I got a little less than halfway through, and then all of a sudden comics were doing well, and I was like, you know, I need to do the thing that pays money. Right. Because I like eating and not dying. And so those are important values for me.
It's always a good way to live your life.
I quit, but I figured I could self-teach on the side. And so I ended up doing all these other projects, and I kind of had to set it aside, which was a real bummer because it really makes me happy to do it. And so finally, I guess where I was getting back to it, but I was like, you know, I learned calculus in college, but I didn't feel like I learned it super rigorously. And I feel like the acid test of whether you know something is whether you can explain it. And so I thought, well, what I should do is force myself to, you know, read a chapter, but then you have to explain it to somebody through a blog. Mm-hmm. And I figured, you know, it's probably good. I'm sure it's good to do just for myself, and that was the main reason I did it. But it was also, I do think some people benefited from it. It was also good because I would explain something and think I was pretty smart, and then someone would be like, "No, you're wrong. You got it exactly backwards." So that was useful. So it was just, it was actually really nice. I even had a couple times. Actually, this is such a good nerd story. I was at a party at San Diego Comic-Con, and a guy was there with his husband, and he was just there. He wasn't like a Hollywood guy or anything. He was just there, like I said, in support, because it was neat. He was a med student. He said the one thing that was giving him trouble was trigonometry. And because I had actually gone back and gone through trig, which I sort of understood superficially the first time, I said to him, you know, the big trick is that there's only one trig function, and it's called sine, or it's called cosine, or whatever you want to call it. But there's only one trig function. Everything else you can derive from the one thing. And he was funny because I feel like I've never done anything worthwhile to humanity at a San Diego Comic-Con. But I got an email from him like 6 months later, and he was like, "Hey, I wanted you to know that really helped me for whatever reason get through this." So it actually ended up being useful. I feel like the subjects that I covered under that blog are ones that I actually understand, whereas the stuff that I learned in school, sometimes it's like a weak structure. You know, you think it's fine, but you poke at it and you realize there's a lot of problems with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. The first time I learned trigonometry myself, I think I felt the same way. It was superficial. I don't know that I really understood it. And only in the past few years of literally teaching trigonometry to high school sophomores. And actually, I used that exact same thing you were saying, where, no, this is the only trig function you need to know. Everything else is a derivation of that one. And really focusing on that understanding. And it seemed like the students picked up on that as well.
Well, I think sometimes you don't...
I agree, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think sometimes you don't know what you know until somebody asks you the right question. This is completely different from math, but I used to teach horseback riding lessons, and these kids would ask me these questions, and I would have never come up with this thing to tell them. And they'd ask me, I was like, oh, I know all of this stuff. It just took people asking the right questions or putting it in the right way to make you realize what you know.
I actually now ask my students on their exams, like, don't just solve this trig problem. There's a great subreddit called Explain It Like I'm 5. Just explain it in a way that makes sense to me. And I literally ask them, like, there's some 8-year-old who says, you know, sine of this angle is 1.5. Tell me why, if that kid is right or wrong, and if it's wrong, tell me why. And they have to explain, like, why that answer can't make any sense. And I think I've learned more from their responses to that about how well they understand the material than anything else I've done.
Well, that's like when I was younger and studying math in high school or junior high before that, and they would always say, show your work. And I didn't, at the time, it wasn't explained to me why showing my work isn't important, but now as an adult looking back on that, it's like, of course that's much more important than getting the right answer is how you did it.
Do you feel, Zach, that the calculus that you were explaining has stuck with you then?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. Well, especially, it's like with that sine thing, like, if you tell someone everything is fine, it doesn't actually. It's not in a certain sense new information. It's just kind of a different way of thinking. Like I feel like as a student, you're like, oh, so there aren't 6 things. There's one thing, and it's sort of relaxing. I feel like stuff like that. Like I feel like I didn't used to have a sort of sense of Euler's constant. Euler's E. I didn't have a sense of like what E is. I knew that you could do tricks on it. Now I sort of have a more I like intuitive sense of it. Or you learn how to push around a derivative, but you don't have a sense of like what am I doing? What does this mean in reality in the universe? That I've done this thing to these numbers. And I feel like that's what was better the second time around is getting a sort of general like it's like if someone asks you a question, can you tell them sort of what the answer should be without having to do the math? And that's where I feel I got to.
Does that happen when you're drawing comics about other subjects as well? When you're doing a comic about psychology or something, do you feel like you really understand those concepts that you're making fun of, or do you have a superficial understanding of it enough to make the joke, but maybe you don't necessarily understand it?
What I do is I really do try to get to where I understand a concept well. Although now and then I do cheat a little. Like I just did one that was about it was a really stupid joke. It was this couple and one decides they aren't going to have sex tonight because, according to the efficient market hypothesis, if the sex were a good idea, it would have already happened by now. The system's at equilibrium. So, but I actually wasn't sure if that was quite the right way to say it. So I got in touch with a friend of mine named Jody Beggs, who runs an economics blog, and she's a behavioral economist, and she runs a blog called Economists Do It With Models. And yeah. But so she changed the wording a little for me so it was more accurate, and so I do it when I'm really far afield from stuff I think I know about. I do try to bug someone. The only problem is it's the moment you bring in someone who's an expert, you're asking for them to be like, well, you need to add 14 more words here to clarify the joke, and then you're in trouble.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So what are your upcoming projects? Now that you're, once this next book is done, are you going to continue with more children's books, or are you going to try to do something different and then come back to the books that you want to write?
I'll tell you what I can tell you. I have a lot of projects. I don't like when something's really tenuous. I don't want to talk about it because it might never happen. But stuff I am definitely doing. We are holding 2 festivals of bad ad hoc hypotheses in October this year. Which should be pretty fun. What else am I doing? I am working on some more kids' books, but it's a little too up in the air to say. Mostly I'm trying to get into prose writing projects, and I like comics, but I'd like to explore some more long-form narrative stuff.
Very cool. Well, Zach, thank you so much for joining us today. You could find Zach. Zach, what's the exact title of your URL so we get that right?
It's SMBC-comics.com, SMBC-comics.com.
Awesome. And you can support Zach's Kickstarter for Augie and the Green Knight. That's going on until July 2nd. Once again, I'm Hemant Mehta.
This is Jessica Blumke.
And this is the podcast for friendlyatheist.com. If you like what you're hearing, feel free to go to patreon.com/Hemant, that's He-Man T, and contribute if you like what you're hearing. Thanks so much. And Zach, thank you again for joining us.